With this section, I want to get into the kinds of insects you might find in a stem or a stalk or the trunk of a fruit tree. Uh, these are just some examples of some of the common insects we have here in North America that have this habit. And I want to start with cane borers. So things that you might find in a caneberry, like a raspberry or a blackberry, or something you might find in currants or gooseberries in the genus Ribes. And the main point here is to show you that there's a great many things, and how you might go about trying to figure out which one is the issue you have. So, if we're just looking at ribes, then there's a very common insect in many parts of the country that is a kind of stem boring moth. It's called the currant borer, and the larvae are a caterpillar, and the adult is a moth. It is the first example of what we're going to come back to later, known as a clearwing borer. When we talk about insects and borers in landscape plants, there's several clearwing borers that are important, and all of them are day-flying moths. Here's a mating pair of the currant borer, and often they have an appearance that makes them resemble some kind of wasp or bee, something that could sting. So these are good mimics of stinging insects. So in this case, the adults are usually out in early June, and you might see them on the leaves or mating on the leaves even. They emerge from the stalk of the plant which they infested the previous year. The pupal skin will get pulled out, and we'll come and revisit this also. Uh, when you have a clearwing borer coming out of a plant, often they will pull and leave extruded the pupal skin, which helps you diagnose what that borer might be. So the adults lay eggs on the surface of the stems. After hatched, the larvae tunnel almost immediately into the stalk, and they will continue feeding throughout the year. And this causes a weakening of the stem, makes them very prone to breaking, and you will often have reduced fruit set on canes that have been girdled in this manner. The mature larvae will tunnel downward. Winter is going to be spent near the base of the plant, and this where they occur is going to be important when we talk about how we get rid of them. What parts of the plant would we wish to remove overwintering stages? A less common one that I see though in my yard and kind of interesting is a insect called the raspberry horntail, and this is a rare example of a sawfly, a kind of wasp, a plant feeding wasp that is associated with a fruit or vegetable crop, in particular one that bores into the stem. So this is essentially a Hymenoptera larva. It will have a head, but it won't have a really head area but it won't be very dark. And they chew in the stems of raspberries and related plants. So adults are present for a brief period in late spring. Rarely would people notice these. They kind of look like several other kinds of wasps. And then the larvae develop in canes. And the symptom you are going to see is a wilting beyond the point where it has done the tunneling. So if you wish to see where the actual larvae are, go to someplace below where you see the symptom. So this would be some more symptoms that I find in my backyard this last summer, where it's just kind of the leaves don't look right. They didn't come out correctly because, again, something had been curdling internally. So ultimately, they will settle near the tip of the stem after tunneling much of the cane, and they are going to overwinter in that stage. There's only one generation produced, but they will be in the cane in the upper part between seasons. Another kind of insect that might be found tunneling within a stem of one of the caneberries or the currants as well is a kind of wood boring beetle. The larval stage is a flat headed borer, and it is the stage that does the actual tunneling. But this one's called the bronze cane borer, or sometimes the rose stem girdler. We'll also see it in rose, which is a related plant to what we're talking about here. They're all in the rose family. And adults are out in June and they lay eggs on the surface of the cane. And this will be the first example where we have a beetle that's in the family we call metallic wood borers, and the larvae that are going to be flat-headed borers. We'll revisit this group in much more detail in the next class because these are very important insects as wood borers and include among their number a very notorious one, the emerald ash borer. But that's for later. So the larvae, again, are a type of flat-headed borer, and this is a kind of a beetle larva that I did cover in the previous class that pointed out that as a borer, beetle larvae often don't have legs, so this is a legless beetle larva. They're going to have a little flattened area behind the head, and they direct their feeding just underneath the bark of the plant on which they're affecting, causing a girdling wound, and this can cause a progressive dieback or progressive thinning of the top growth because it's not getting nutrients and may die beyond an area that is extensively injured. So here we can see meandering tunnels right underneath the bark, and that is what you see typical of flat-headed borers, this kind of important group of wood-boring beetles. And then there's one that I've never experienced. It's more common in the more northern areas in New England and Pacific Northwest called a raspberry maggot. This is an example of a fly that causes wilting in this group of plants. So the kind of injury is illustrated probably most easily seen on the left picture on the left, and there'll be an area of the stem that is discolored, and beyond that it wilts. This is a series of pictures from a publication in New Hampshire, and in the picture on the upper left, you can see a tiny hole in the stalk, and that would be the exit hole. There might be evidence of girdling beyond or just below the point where you see wilting. And if you get there at the right time, you might see the larva. It is a maggot, it is a fly larva. They're not going to have a head capsule at all. Their mouth parts are little hooks. So these are legless maggots. And this is one of the few that develops within a stem. In the next class, we'll talk about rose midge, another insect that causes sort of similar injury. Some diagnostics on this is happening early. This is probably the earliest of all of the insects in a caneberry that would cause some sort of wilting to appear. So this is usually going to be showing up by June, the symptoms. And if you find the insect again, it is a fly larva. No legs, no prolegs, only a small dark area of the head where the mouth hooks are. So what do we do about cane borers in fruit crops? Cultural controls are very important. Pruning out and destroying infested canes before adults emerge in spring or whenever would be probably the most important single thing. So some of these, like the raspberry uh, horntail or the raspberry maggot, you could see wilting and remove the plant tissue at that point when you're seeing wilting. Others, you may not do the cleanup and removal of the larvae until the end of the year, and maybe take out the whole cane, and certainly the part of the cane that has the active stages of these insects we're talking about here. We can also try to optimize the growing conditions for the plant. Many borers are associated with stress, in particular the flat-headed borers. Others are not, though. This is not a universal kind of cultural control that is going to help you with some of these borers that we see in canes. The issue here, again, for identifying borer-affected canes and discard or kill developing larvae, do that when they're in the cane and you can identify it. And again, that may be in the growing season or maybe at the end of the growing season. So the other issues that could be involved in control would be chemical controls. There are no chemical controls I can find that are allowed for use in a home garden that would control any of these. So in a home garden, you are going to be working more in these cultural controls, in particular identifying the infested plant material and getting rid of it. Now, if you're a commercial producer of these crops, there's a much greater range of options, chemical control options. And these are examples of two publications, and I'm going to send these to you also as an announcement for sources of information on the insecticides that are allowed on some of these crops in commercial production. But the two I show here, the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide, is done by several states and is an excellent regional publication. There's another one for the New England and New York area in the Northeast, and then there's a very good series done by Pacific Northwest. If you're looking for information on insecticides that are used to control fruit pests, I really recommend you do look at the Pacific Northwest Pest Management Handbooks. But there's also one other thing that I want to bring up in this issue with cane borers, and that is that you will sometimes see in these plants insects in the cane, but they are not a pest. They are a pith nester. And I want to make a distinction between these two things. The borers are going to be something that lives by consuming the tissues of the plant. They girdle it and they cause wilting and the like. But then there's others that may just use the stem as a nest site. And these are often beneficial species. So be aware there's two different kinds of things you might see in plants with these small canes. And some of the kinds of insects that nest in the pith of a plant would be solitary bees. The group known as the small carpenter bees can be very common, and they will excavate the center area of the pith. They'll stay in the pith. They won't be going into the tissues that would be sustaining the plant. And then they will make cells and pack it with pollen and nectar, enough to support one young. You can also have leafcutter bees going in and hunting wasps. So this would be pith nesting by some small carpenter bees. And you might see little cells with a bit of kind of chewed plant material between each one within the stem. And so that's one group of native bees, the small carpenter bees. Leafcutter bees, if they use one of these stems, they're of course going to be making their nest cells out of little fragments of leaves. And so they'll be in the pith, but you won't see little chambers. You'll see little cells made up of multiple leaf fragments, like we discussed in the last class. And is again another picture of leafcutter bees, in this case on the stem of penstemon, an ornamental plant. And then there's a lot of little tiny hunting wasps, wasps that go and collect certain kinds of insects that are used as prey to support their young. And these small species often will nest in cavities, and the cavity might be a rose cane or a raspberry cane or a cane of a currant or a bamboo stake in your garden for that matter. The ones that I have common in my yard are in the genus Pemphirodon, and those go after little things like aphids. So I might have a cane that I cut and pruned to expose the pith, and I open it up, and there's multiple cells. Now, I don't have a picture of them with their prey, but if I had taken this picture in the lower right a little earlier, it would have shown a cell that was packed full of paralyzed prey, aphids, and then the young wasp larva would consume those the prey that was there, and then in the picture in the lower right, you can see a full-grown larva and a pupa of this uh, kind of wasp that later will emerge and repeat. Okay, so let's move on to another insect that has a slightly different habit, and these are ones you're going to find in branches and maybe even the main trunk. It's a single species that I'm going to talk about that has this habit with fruit trees, and it is an example of a bark beetle. We'll talk about bark beetles a lot more when we come back to the next class when we talk about landscape plants. But there's one important bark beetle in fruit crops in the United States and Canada called the shot-hole borer. Gets its name because it emerges through small holes, which you could call a shot hole. Now, we've used that term earlier when we talked about the injury to leaves that's produced by, in particular, flea beetles. But The shot-hole borer is a common bark beetle that emerges through little tiny holes you see in various kinds of fruit trees, in particular stone fruits, peach and plum. The adults are out in early spring. They often do a little bit of feeding, often around the base of a bud. So there's a little bark beetle feeding at the base of the bud. This is what they use to uh, use as food as they mature their ovaries, and then later the females will enter the plant and make a gallery and lay eggs under it. So this is our first example of a bark beetle and how bark beetles do and do produce in plants is the adult actively goes into the plant. The mother and the males will also be involved in it, but the mother will make a tunnel underneath the bark and lay her eggs underneath the bark, unlike the other things we've talked about that lay their eggs on the surface. These are examples of twigs that have been colonized by shot-hole borer. You can see the little holes. Sometimes there might be ooze coming from these holes as well. If it's a shot hole, if it's a kind of stone fruit, prunus, those always will ooze if you have some kind of wound. So, if successful, underneath the bark there will be eggs laid in chambers, and then the eggs will then hatch and the larvae will try to develop. Often trees can resist, and if you see a lot of gum, then the tree probably has successfully resisted that individual mother who is trying to produce an egg gallery underneath. And this would be a kind of flush out, and we'll talk about more of that later too, how trees can defend themselves against a borer that tries to get underneath the bark. So you might see some gum, and that could mean that the insect has been successfully killed by the tree defenses. But if larvae can successfully develop in twigs, then they will girdle the area right underneath the bark. This generally will happen on branches, twigs, or trunks of trees that are in poor condition. A good, healthy tree is usually able to successfully resist attacks. But as the trees get older and they have less ability to resist attacks, these kinds of insects may come in, maybe just on a limb, or maybe ultimately into the main trunk. So pupation occurs in the tunnel. The adults then chew their way out through the bark. After they have emerged from that pupal stage, there'll be 2 generations, uh, maybe even 3 generations in some areas, particularly in warmer areas. So with shot-hole borers, again, cultural controls involve removal of infested plant material. So this is pruning out and destroying infested limbs before adults emerge. And perhaps I should make this point stronger because I think I failed to earlier. When you do pruning and you have living stages of these borers in them, you have to destroy the material. You cut it and leave it in place. The insects will usually be able to successfully complete their development in the prune material that you've left in your garden or your field or whatever. You've got to destroy it. You've got to remove it. With shot-hole borer, optimized growing conditions to promote plant vigor is very important, as it is with most all bark beetles. And chemical controls are going to be applied preventively during periods of egg laying if needed. Again, usually cultural controls can keep this under a reasonable management. But I don't know of anything that is allowed for use by a homeowner in a garden that would be effective for this. Again, what's available to commercial applicators is often very different from what we have in available to a homeowner. Now, to finish off, I just want to talk about 2 kinds of interesting insects that are associated with vegetables that tunnel into plants. And perhaps the most spectacular of these is an insect called the squash vine borer, which unfortunately we don't have here in Colorado. I guess fortunately we don't, but it is a striking insect. This would be found in the eastern half of the United States. And it's going to affect plants in the squash family. So I'm going to use the term cucurbits, and I've used the term cucurbits as squash family plants. And some plants are quite susceptible to squash vine borer, like summer squash, winter squash, pumpkins. And other cucurbits are infrequently damaged, like cucumbers, melons, watermelons. These are all cucurbits. And there are some differences in cultivar resistance within these groups. So, for instance, butternut squash is a type of winter squash, and it seems to be quite resistant to squash vine borer relative to other winter squash. The adult of this insect is a striking moth, a very pretty moth, a fairly large moth, and it flies during the day. This is also a clear wing borer in that family, like the current borer I showed you. And they have one generation in most areas, and it usually appears in late May into June. It's usually over by the end of June. And there may be two generations in some areas, but mostly it is a one generation species. And if we can get past that first generation, we're in pretty good shape. The moths will lay their eggs often on the stem near the soil line. So these little arrows here all indicate eggs that were laid at the base of a squash stem. And then the egg hatches, and the larva enters and tunnels within the stalk or the stem of the squash plant. And this usually occurs right around the soil line. So here are a couple of images of squash vine borer damage. And you can see it's a fairly large larva when it becomes full grown. There's a lot of waste that it produces, this frass, the waste material. It's pretty obvious once you have cut into a plant that has this insect that it has been present or is present. And because of this, points beyond where the injury occurs will often start to wilt and maybe even die. It is not uncommon for them to be able to kill plants. Now, as a project for about this time of in the class, I have asked you to look at the Journal of Integrated Pest Management, and I hope you spend some time on this project because this is a really great uh, resource, I think. And just while preparing this, I looked to see what they had in squash vine borer, and they have a wonderful, complete review of what is known about this insect and how to manage it. And these kinds of things are what you'd find in the Journal of Integrated Pest Management. So that's why I want you to do that project. But anyway, if you wanted more on this insect, look there. But in general, for squash vine borer in home gardens, we will talk about planting cultivars that are more resistant. Delaying planting until after egg laying, that's not always possible, but if you could delay putting out the plants until early July, then usually the period is past when this insect has done most of its egg laying and you can safely plant. You could monitor for the activity of the adults. Now, the best way to do this is with pheromone traps, and there's some excellent pheromone traps. For homeowners, you might just see it. This, if you've got a good eye, these are pretty big and interesting looking moths. Or there's some reports that you could use a yellow pan, a yellow colored pan with maybe some water, maybe a little soap to break the surface tension, and they would often be caught in that. That would tell you when they're around. When the adults are around, one thing you could do is cover the plants so they can't get to them. It doesn't need to be done for long, maybe 2, 3 weeks, and then take the covering off because you need to have the plants open if you're going to have the blossoms pollinated. You could possibly use insecticides. There are some allowed for homeowner use. These should be directed at the base of the plant when the adult activity and egg laying is present. Or one thing is if you have some injury, you could carefully slice into the stem, find the larva, kill it, just spear it, and then after that, cover that area with soil, and often this will reroot. These kinds of plants do readily reroot if they're in contact with the soil. So those are things you might do in your own garden. And then the last insect I want to discuss is European corn borer. Now, this is mostly a pest of field corn, but it has a huge range of different kinds of plants it affects, including some vegetable crops. Presently, this is an insect that is east of the Rocky Mountains as well, an introduced species. The caterpillar will develop on often in the stems of plants. It is a borer in interior parts of the plant. Often it's the stems, but we also will see some cases of them going into fruits and developing seeds, like in that bell pepper example in the lower right. But you might find them in the corn stalk or the corn ear, or there's one developing in hemp. The adults are moderate-sized moths. They fly at night. Usually they're found in the daytime. You might stir some up along the edges of a field, usually dense vegetation at the edge of the field. Weedy areas are where they'll spend the day. This is an insect that lays its eggs in a mass, so there may be uh, several dozen coming out of a single egg mass. So these might be more clumped. You might see them in certain areas of a field. You know, a couple plants nearby next to each other have a lot, and others don't have any. Um, the eggs will hatch after a week or so, and this insect almost immediately will move inside the plant. It feeds only very briefly on the outside of the plant. So we have a very brief window when we can control it with any kinds of sprays. As a result, it goes into the plant and then spends the rest of its development in this inside of the plant, in the stalk, in the corn ear, in the pepper fruit, pupates within the plant. Among the vegetable crops that you might see this insect in, green beans getting in the pods, sweet corn, that's probably the number one, peppers, as I've mentioned. It's also in all sorts of other plants, including various ornamental plants, geraniums, you might see it in, or even small seedling trees, they sometimes come in, and many common weeds, particularly ones that have got a good stalk, say um, something like ragweed. That's a common weedy host of this insect. It also, some of you I know are interested in hemp. This insect is the one that was mentioned as being most important in hemp when it was grown back in the 1940s, the key pest of the crop at that time. Now, however, this seems to be minimally important. I've seen very few reports of this being observed in hemp anywhere, and pretty much the only places that have reported seeing some is in the uh, northeastern part of the United States. Uh, and also, this is it just makes the plants a little more branch a little more if you do have some, which may not be a bad thing. Anyway, the kinds of things we use to manage European corn borer is destruction of crop residues again. This is an insect that has a habit of surviving within the plant debris. If you have an insect that has that habit, if you remove the plant debris and in a way to kill the developing insects, that will help reduce the population between seasons. You can monitor to detect periods when the adults are out, and when they're out and laying eggs, there are pheromone traps for European corn borer used extensively. However, and this is a little odd, there are regional differences in the pheromones that are used. So the ones in the northeast part of the country use a slightly different pheromone than the ones that are found elsewhere. So you may want to look into that a little more to see which of the two pheromone blends are best for your corn borers. Use of insecticides, time for egg hatch peaks, because again, these are insects that you will not be able to get once they're in the plant. So it's timing is everything. And there are some resistant cultivars. However, I have to say the biggest use of where we have resistant cultivars involves GMO corn that has certain BT genes. I don't know, what you may think about GMO crops, but European corn borer is way less important than it used to be, largely because it is so heavily suppressed by GMO varieties of field corn. It used to be far more important. We used to spray a lot more for it than we do since we have that. Anyway, so those are some of the insects you might find within stems, stalks, and sometimes the fruit of above ground plants.